Right, welcome everybody to our session on the future of warehousing and freight efficiency. Thank you for joining after the delay last week, and we appreciate your attendance. So as we all know, with the COVID-driven supply chain issues, they continue to worsen. Manufacturing, logistics, and supply chain leaders are now struggling to find ways to mitigate risk, build resilience, and find actionable opportunities. Our guests today will be sharing their decades of experience and using their experience to provide insight into some of these challenges and answering some of your pressing questions.
Thanks, Maggie. Appreciate the time and appreciate Craig and Bob hopping on here to talk about a pretty pressing topic. So what we're going to do is just talk what we're seeing overall as a consulting firm in this space. And I'll do a quick bio, and then we're going to turn it over to Craig just to talk about the state of the industry for retail and CPG specifically, consumer packaged goods there. And then Bob's going to talk about transportation and freight in the context of just the last few years and what's happening on the capacity, the cost front, some of the third-party 3PL and other suppliers. But I'm Jared Federici, and thanks for making the time today. I look after our delivery and quality for the Foyer Group in North America, all our project work. And about a half of our projects now are focused in some area of supply chain. In some cases, tactical warehousing improvement projects to get after operating expenses. In other cases, freight. In other cases, supply chain network design. This crosses through across retail, consumer packaged goods, manufacturing, and other industries, but a lot of the challenges are fairly consistent, and I think we're starting to see some themes emerge. Certainly, a lot of this may not be a surprise. There might be some surprises, but we'll go ahead and dive into this. So thanks again for attending. Obviously, the recent disruption is quite significant, and I think we're having quite a bit of challenge. Especially on the forecasting and prediction side. If it was consistent, then even if things were negative and we were having supply chain challenges, if they were predictable, I think we'd be in better shape. The issue is that we're seeing lack of visibility, lack of predictability in some of the effects, and that's one of the challenges. You can see here, I think disruption detection is becoming a theme given that. So organizations that had limited visibility prior now are seeking that. And we see a lot of that in technology enhancements and requirements for organizations. In terms of some of the recent trends we're seeing, one, obviously, bullwhip effect issues, and Craig will speak a little bit more to this, but simply challenges on the ordering side, the buyer side, and being able to predict what we can expect to come in any reasonable fashion. And so over ordering, especially getting back to basics in the retail context of order management has been a key challenge, because we're ordering, assuming that we're not going to get full containers, or assuming that one's not going to be available. And all of a sudden, sometimes they are, and then we get stuck with too much inventory. So certainly a big theme that we're seeing across organizations, especially in retail. Obviously, in some cases, we're just flat out delayed, out of stocks across organizations. Again, especially retail, are quite high and significant. And a lot of the challenges we're seeing is to what degree are those controllable in the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic, and is that still an excuse? Is it not? And to what degree can we improve? So we'll kind of talk about in the next slide about what some of these questions are that we're seeing pop up, and perhaps likely you're seeing as well. Certainly an examination of the vendor network is happening across the board. So if it wasn't already happening via discipline, balanced scorecarding for third-party suppliers, it's happening now. I think reliance on a limited set has certainly exacerbated some of these issues and maybe exposed lack of resiliency, certainly on the vendor side, no doubt. We've got, like I spoke about before, some technologies around visibility. It may not necessarily be optimal routing design and transportation management, but it would be node detection and visibility management, especially on inbound, that we're starting to see large investments come in, which is not surprising. Starting to see a little more RPA and artificial intelligence in the context of prediction algorithms to find out where is my stuff and when's it going to get here as much as possible. With some success, some limited success, I'd say. Certainly on the commodity side, so no doubt on this. If we didn't have scorecarding or analytics in the context of affinity grouping and categorizing our spend and looking at visibility in the sourcing context, I think the procurement, the level of expertise required in procurement recently has certainly amplified and certainly turned our procurement professionals into subject matter experts at the commodity level or sub-commodity level, certainly. And then finally, massive and dramatic issues on talent acquisition and retention. So lots of creative ideas coming up to hold and get talent, especially in the warehouses, especially order selectors, folks doing inbound and outbound and put away, and keeping those key folks, especially on second and third shifts, who really make the warehouse run happy and attracted and not above the 50% turnover rate. So real challenges there on the talent and people side, perhaps more so than many of the others. But nonetheless, these are some themes that we're seeing. The common questions that we're getting here is, as a result of this, what's controllable? Now we've got commodity prices going up, oil's going to continue to go up likely, and so our average cost to get things in is up 3, 5, 10x, sometimes more. So from a P&L perspective, or operating expenses, a percentage of revenue, or my DC expenses as a percentage of revenue, what's actually controllable? CFOs are working with the leadership teams to try to make budget reviews, and we don't know what the right answer is for what's controllable. I think that's one of the challenges that we're seeing, because it's quite difficult to predict and to know, and also for leaders to make reasonable goals that they can hit in the absence of the known. So that's certainly a huge question we're seeing. The second one is really around visibility management. So how can I actually see products? How can I see my network? How can I predict and understand and make plans based on what's known? We might have data tables in WMS and TMS that our routing algorithms produce pick sheets and other routing lists, but we don't necessarily have the right or optimal visibility to the entire network as a whole, overlaid on a map to help us predict and manage the business. We're able to react a bit, but in terms of predicting and mitigating that in advance, I think people are really struggling. Thirdly, we're seeing the unraveling of processes that maybe we were getting away with in the past, now not. Some, especially on the visibility of processes and getting back to basics, especially in periphery functions like buying and merchandising and supply chain that are support functions. I think that we have no more room for error, and the organizations that were really tight on their processes are better than their competitors, most certainly. And finally, how do we keep our people? And this is one we've got some thoughts on, but I don't know that anyone's particularly solved this completely. But I certainly think that creativity is one adjective to have in mind with this, and also culture. So getting past just the money side of things is quite important. But we're seeing in many of our warehouse networks and other supply chains, larger turnover and difficulty in onboarding and talent acquisition numbers than we've ever seen. So that doesn't help. So these are some of the core questions we're seeing. So how do we get after some of these things? There's no silver bullet. We don't have that to offer. However, I do think that there's 4 core things that you can get after in a reasonable time frame, with reasonable expense management and good ROI. One of them is the ability to know what's controllable within your network on the P&L and on the balance sheet. So being able to rapidly do some benchmarking assessments, it's likely in a data-rich environment where we generally have, even in the mid-market, some WMS capabilities and some transportation management capabilities. You likely have a lot of KPIs, a lot of data points. And so being able to take something and extract maybe the key 50, 60 KPIs, even at a pretty tactical level, and ingest them into a tool and spit out a report that shows where your competitors are at for cost per case, or average routing efficiency or cost per mile, et cetera, can give you a sense as to what the opportunities are pretty quickly. Taking 4, 5, 6 months to do analyses on what the opportunities are in your supply chain networks is not going to fly anymore. We got to be able to do this in 3 to 5 weeks, and start to remove some of the excuses about what's really possible in the operation in terms of goal setting. So this is one we'll talk about later. We've actually got a very specific product for this that we're working with organizations to do, and we can show you just an example of what that actually looks like. Similarly, on the freight side, and Bob will talk about this as well, the ability to do in a matter of weeks a complete assessment of all your carriers and third parties around costs, and be able to maximize your negotiating power for your size with your vendors, and to balance cost is important. Lack of visibility to what you ought to be paying or what your competitors are paying is killer. And so I think that being able to, similarly on the freight side, rapidly assess and diagnose where we can save is key. And again, Bob's team is best in the world at that, and he'll talk a little bit about that competency later on. Finally, on the technology accelerators here, I think that it's not necessarily getting better at implementing warehouse management systems and transportation management systems. I think a lot of it is digitizing the network, especially on the inbound side, and leveraging those key nodes and other predictive analytics to really get after scenario planning so that we can run the business, versus getting better reports that help you react. I think that's the way of the dinosaur now. It's really just around here are the top 3 scenarios with statistical confidence level of 86% that we expect, and in each of these, this is exactly what we're going to do, because we have visibility to what we think the 3 permutations are going to be. I think those are the conversations that technology enablement is allowing leaders to have in the optimal firms. And then finally, really around complexity reduction, getting back to the basics. We still see organizations not operating consistently on their basic processes. We see lots of different creative compensation models that are coming around, especially not necessarily piecework, but balanced scorecard or blended work based, team, but also individual goals. And so, how do you do that if you're an organization that may not have engineered labor standards, at a 95% confidence level? I think for the mid-market and smaller organizations, a lot of them are getting creative, maybe offering to pay for school or, university programs, or a part of that, or other learnings, or and also the value of culture too, and having a workplace that's more than just picking cases. So I think that there's a number of fronts there on the people side. If you can keep your order selectors, your inbound, your shipping folks happy, in the less than 30% turnover range, you're going to be operating quite effectively compared to comp. So nonetheless, I think these are some simple things, some pretty quick things potentially that can help mitigate some of these that we're seeing. And obviously there's a lot more to come, but I'm going to pause there and move us into a little more depth with Craig and Bob here But again, as you have questions, please pop those into chat, and we'd be happy to take that along. So without further ado, Craig, I'm going to move it over to you and talk just about what you're seeing in retail and CPG and some of the other specifics. So Craig, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jared. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for the time. For those in the East Coast, I guess we're between you and lunch, so we'll try and keep it everybody informed and moving along. Quick graphic here. We talk about the bullwhip effect, and you can see some of the as you look across, the three phases of, how we flattened it, we were fighting it, and kind of as we move forward as it relates to COVID in particular, you can kind of see the, how we got that full stop almost it's going on a couple of years now with that economic activity, and how that spike, shot up, and we have people working from home remotely, and that intervention piece, right, where the different organizations, government support coming into play. And then as we battle through it, and you can see we coming down, we had our spikes along the way in terms of the different variants as they rolled through. But, the vaccine, certainly in North America as it rolls in, has provided more of that stability as we get back up to kind of where we were again 2 years ago. So the key challenges become obviously there are a lot of learnings happening, and Jared's highlighted a lot of those in terms of from a consulting side and how we can start addressing them. Where do we take this in terms of future? And as we move through, this last sort of wave, we're getting a lot of back to work, back to office mandates are happening. So it's a whole adjustment. People have been at home for 2 years, on the people side of things. So it's going to be a interesting, call it future. And what are the sort of, as supply chain leaders and practitioners, what can we take from this, and what are some of the things we can leverage from what Jared had talked about, and certainly what Bob will highlight as we wrap these together. Can you go to the next slide, please, Maggie? So from that, call it bullwhip, full stop, back to future, kind of, and again, leveraging certainly around what Jared had said, and bringing it more into the practical, supply chain sort of, practitioners. One of the things, and Jared touched on, was that visibility, getting the vendor, when you think about, the supplier to retail link, obviously improving your service levels. Obviously those get a lot of the, you get your end-to-end savings. But, one of the things that, we often overlook is once you get that visibility and understanding, it has an impact on working capital. If you can start to minimize the dollars being spent, whether you're in the CPG or retail side of things, that starts adding value. And as a practitioner, you kind of, as you look across opportunities, you always want to put a lens on what is the value. I've spent, a career in supply chain. I don't want to say how long, because they'll just say how old I am, but suffice to say, I've been a practitioner in CPG, retail, and consulting. So I've had the opportunity of seeing, taking best practices, applying them up and down the supply chain. And the one thing I always like to use is, what's the payback? What's the benefit? And certainly when you look at implementing visibility, you're looking at, a 10% cost savings or service improvement. That just comes when you start to look at, and again, everyone's on a different curve in terms of efficiencies, but there's always something to be had, especially when you think about the disruption we just had. It uncovered a lot of, whether it was neglected or inefficient connection points, it speaks to, there's definitely, opportunities to be had by getting at it. And the next point is looking around, when we think about what we went through in number 2, is around flexibility and prioritizing those capabilities. So you think about, when certainly in CPG, and when I spent time there with the sales and operation planning, I mean, that was very collaborative internally, but again, that helped, understand our constraints, whether it's the sales guys overselling, a line, or efficiencies at the plant level for production planning, all leading to, again, what's the value? What am I getting for this? Obviously reduced cycle time, faster order fulfillment, those kind of elements. And when we think about capabilities, the one goes back, well, again, a few years now, when we talk about competing on capabilities. One of a great Harvard study was done on Walmart and how they competed with Kmart, and their real capability was cross-docking. If for those of you remember, they really pioneered that and spent a lot of capital and an inordinate amount, but they saw that as their success. So when you think about capabilities, it always comes to mind that Walmart, they invested a lot of money to build cross-docking, which for those of you, who've been around a while, cross-docking seems to be it's always been there. It wasn't always there, and they were one of the pioneers. So, as we think about as practitioners, what are the capabilities you have that you can leverage and become that competitive killer on competency. 3, again, more integration, right? How do we tighten up this supply chain and get us integrated between the supplier, the vendor, and our customers? So again, here you're always looking for the value. What's the value? Your service, your cost improvements, all increasing. And again, I'll say there's always 10%. I always look for 10%. There's always 10% to be had. Service, cash improvement. When you think about the constraints, one of the elements, and again, pioneered and driven really home by Amazon, was the concept of available to promise. Endless aisles, right? So everybody, I'm sure, here has been a consumer and utilized Amazon services, but they will never tell you what they have in stock. What they will tell you is when they're going to get it to you, and you have the option then as the consumer to say, I'm going to accept 2 weeks, or 10 days, or 2 days, or next day. For those of you in closer urban centers, they're doing same day deliveries, which is taking it a long way from the days of when they were just a bookseller, right? And now they got the endless aisles. 4, reduce complexity. Again, that's always a constant as a practitioner. You're always looking to simplify, keeping it simple. But again, by reducing your complexity, you're reducing your inventory levels, you're getting efficiencies. Think of complexity, whether you're in CPG or retail, been in both. SKU rationalization always comes to mind. You're always looking to tighten that up, get the tail end out. Listen, sometimes you have to carry the tail. When you think about baking mixes, you got the chocolate and the vanilla are always number one, but guess what? You carry the lemon just because it fills out the category, right? So although it's a D or an E or an F in terms of velocity, you're going to carry it just because the customer wants it. But it always gives you an opportunity to, again, reduce the complexity. SKU rationalization is always an area that can never, it's always got to be top of mind as any practitioner. And ultimately, 5, we talk about, listen, if we've learned nothing from the whole experience the last couple of years, is having contingency plans. And that all starts with, if we're starting to learn from there, what are we going to control in costs? Because right now, and Bob will talk about, and Jared talked earlier, our freight costs. We're getting rocked every time. Bob and I were talking earlier, and our fuel surcharges, are you seeing them? They're like almost 50% of the goods you're buying. When you think about container rates, they're 30,000 plus a container from the Orient internal. Not to mention, as these fuel prices continue to go upwards, it's a challenge, right? So now's the time to get on top of your costs and start to develop those savings now for the future. And then ultimately, as I said, through each 5 of these, always got to remember the bottom line impact that this gives you. Always looking for both the financial and the service, payback as you look across any of the opportunities ahead of you. And there's always money to be had, and always efficiencies to be had. That's a common, regardless if we've gone through COVID or not. I'd always challenge and continue to challenge to push that forward. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Bob, and he's going to dive in a little more on the freight and where that's going, how we help.
Thank you.
Over to you, Bob.
Thank you. Again, The first thing that this says is what's changed over the last 5 years. I go back to when we started our company about 15 years ago. What we had as our motto was that we were a supply chain optimization company. I said back then people couldn't spell supply chain. Now it's the second most important item that is on every news broadcast. So what I've got here are about 7 things that either have taken place, are taking place, and we'll just go through them very quickly. The first one is sourcing is now farther and farther away. And to me, that's a trade-off between lower labor costs, primarily in the manufacturing area, for higher supply chain costs and higher risks. And risks in terms of, I can remember back when we first started to outsource overseas, quality was a big issue. You'd open the container door and you'd find the product wasn't to the spec that you wanted. And then today, service disruptions. That's the other thing that's really causing a lot of risks. The second item is once that outsourcing was decided, then people started to get into, I want faster service and I want to reduce my costs. So that went through a period of time to make it more economic as far as just the transportation supply chain costs. The next one is supply chains are made up of links, and the longer the supply chain, the more links and the more points of failure. And we see that all the time. When people were outsourcing, in a lot of cases, before they started to see the quality issues, a lot of them had a single source. And that has completely changed now, where people are now looking and saying, you're my primary provider, but I'm going to also have number 2 and number 3, just in case there's a disruption in the supply chain, either a natural disaster or things that we're seeing in terms of capacity squeezes right now. The ripple effect of disruptions. And the classic one in the Canadian environment would be what happened in the Fraser Valley. We lost rail tracks, we lost trucks, roads, and what people started to have to do was to resource where they were shipping, for example, into British Columbia. Previously out of a Vancouver warehouse, well, what they ended up doing was shipping more out of Calgary. And they did circuitous routing. They actually had some trucks that were moving down through the States and back up into Canada, and completely changed everything for them. The other concept that we're starting to see a little bit more now of is what we call glocalization. And what that means is it's a more balanced mix between offshore sourcing and onshore sourcing. And I think that's going to improve. It's going to be a bigger issue because people have been behind the 8 ball, I'll say, for the past 2 to 3 years, as an example. The other thing that we're starting to see too is continuous design. It's no longer static designs in supply chain. And the key thing, as far as I'm concerned, is the data allows us more evaluations and possible scenarios that we can look at to, again, go back to reducing supply chain costs and also to reduce the risks that we're facing. Next slide, please. So very briefly, we'll take a look at really what I will call the transportation industry. First one is ocean freight, and that's been characterized by major port blockages. We've heard stories of 100 container ships being off the coast in LA and Long Beach. And Craig also mentioned we actually had a customer who 3 years ago was paying about $3,500 to move a container from Singapore to Toronto. And the last time he got a quote, it was over $30,000. And his comment to me was, you know what? I'm not even going to place the order because it's costing me more to move the product from the Orient into Toronto than it does to buy the product. And I can't afford doing that. The other thing that we're seeing in ocean freight too is the actual sailing times are shorter than the port dwell times. So at origin, you're 5, 6 days to get it on a ship. And once it arrives, even in a place like Montreal, you're now starting to see, well, it's arrived on the 1st and we'll get it to you out of the yard by the 7th. And that's very common in terms of that industry. Trucking industry characterized by driver shortages and all of the blockages that we've seen, weather related, border related, protest related. And then the air freight area. And again, when you look, it's related to capacity limits. And actually, we've noticed a lot of spillover from the ocean freight, where the transit time is so long that they will ship a smaller part of the order via air. And that again is now putting more constraints in terms of air capacity. And from our experience, virtually all air and ocean shipments today are spot quoted. Forget about a rate that I quoted and I gave it to you for the next 6 months. Not anymore. And we actually have had a customer who said, I had to quote, I was given a quote and it was good for 3 hours. So that's the frequency and that's the changes that are taking place in the industry. So next slide, please. Here are some comments that I'll make in terms of maybe some solutions that you might want to think about. And also some comments about what's happening in the industry. The first one is the providers are putting capacity where the money is. If you're a guy and you're running a trucking company, and previously for the last 25 years, you were at the mercy of the shipper, well, now the shoe is on the other foot. And they're making decisions of, do I put this unit into this particular move at $1,000, or do I put it somewhere else where I can make $1,500? And that's going on constantly in terms of all modes. Things like being able to anticipate the seasonality of produce-related moves and getting a better understanding of that so that you can manage and see the capacity that's moved out of, and I'll use the example, reefer freight, once the produce has started to slow down and it goes more to local, and managing that reefer freight to dry van. And that happens at specific times, and you can start to anticipate that. Keeping drivers, and again, we've talked about this in a number of different areas, but drivers are very important, and they also have alternatives, and they look for places, things like, I want to be home for the weekends. So which carrier can I now take my capacity to so that I can get home and be with my family on the weekends? The next one, we mentioned a little bit about spot quote versus long-term contracts. We see a big shift. My gut feel tells me we're about 25% now in the trucking business into the spot quote market. And as one person I heard speak the other day who said, when you look at contract rates, that's the climate. And when you look at spot rates, that's the weather. And I thought that was a great comparison, and it really brought that point home. Some of the stuff that I think are really key to the future, being able, as Jared has said, to control some of these costs, is the use of real-time data to get at the actual cost that you're incurring. And that real-time data, in a lot of cases, is available. There are a lot of services now that will actually tell you what the historic pricing has been for truckload within a given lane. They'll actually do a projection of what they think the price is going to be in the future. So this allows you to do I'll call it a timed RFP versus I always do one in December for the following year. So again, a lot more use and a lot more benefit by using real-time data. The other one is, I believe, one of the keys, and that's building relationships with the carriers to create mutual benefits and remove waste from the supply chain. What do I mean by that? Well, you know what? Maybe I can send the carrier an electronic bill of lading, which then eliminates some of their costs in terms of data entry at their shop. But people have asked me about 5 years ago at a conference, like, how is the relationship between the carrier and the shipper? And like, is it getting better or worse? And my reaction was, it never existed, because the carrier didn't trust the shipper and the shipper didn't trust the carrier. So you know what? It's got to change. And we've got to be able to say to each other, how can I help you reduce your cost, Mr. Carrier? If I ship more product on Monday and Tuesday, does that help you? And can I get better rates? Can I have standby shipments where I don't have to really get it? It's going into a distribution center somewhere, and I'll load it in the trailer. And when you, Mr. Carrier, want to move it, you move it based on your schedule. And all of those things are designed to take, I call it, the waste out of the supply chain. And this is the last comment that I'll make, is in my estimation, transportation is all about data. And the old saying was, you can't manage what you can't measure. And this means that you cannot know whether you were successful unless success is defined and tracked in real time. So with that, Jared, back to you.
Thanks, Bob. And a really good segue. So we've been talking freight here, and again, Bob's team has got a very similar capabilities. So we're going to be focused now on primarily within the four walls of a distribution center and some of the supply chain pieces, less on the freight side. But similarly to this, Bob's team has got a great tool that's also able to ingest actual carrier invoices, and sometimes in a bit of a messy manner, whether it's a PDF or it doesn't have to necessarily be a great clean data sheet with all, but this essentially ingests and spits out where you're able to save, where some of your competitors are actually spending, whether it's $1.97 a mile or what have you, and you're paying $2.50. So think about that in parallel. But this piece here is a tool that's been developed to sort of really mitigate some of the challenges within the four walls of, where ought I be? What should I be picking? How many lines per hour? Am I high on the overtime side? Am I low? What's the proper ratio of supervisor to hourly folks on the floor? All those tactical KPIs that you may not normally see, or you may struggle to get if you do a Google search. So that's what we've put together here. And this is one of the tools we're using to support our clients to find out how much opportunity do we actually have at the site. So this is the scorecard model. And again, this is something that doesn't take 6 months. It takes, in some cases, 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the richness and the availability of your data. It's not just a data-based approach, though. Again, anecdotally, you got to walk the floor, you got to talk to people, you got to see the site as well. But we'll be focusing on this tool and what we're able to do. And I think as you're able to build and develop these tools yourselves internally, this will help. Especially, you may not have external benchmarks of some of your competitors, but you may have internal benchmarks of some of your sites, especially if you're in a large network. So navigating the tool here in terms of what we built to accommodate this, one is getting the data model set up and setting up our control panel. So you can see we've got, in this particular case, a warehouse in the produce wholesale industry. And so we're able to look at different currencies, whether it's USD, the euro, Canadian dollar specifically, and you're actually able, we'll show a little bit later, this tool basically ingests the top 50, 70, 100 KPIs within your organization and bumps that up against a competitor set. We've got hundreds of KPIs in here so that you know where you stand with regard to your warehouse. And then you click a button and it spits out a 30, 40-page report with everything cleaned up and all the opportunities outlined there. So I think these are some of the tips and tricks to look at your sites in a rapid manner and find what the opportunity is. And that's the basis of this tool. So again, we're not spending 4 weeks building the PowerPoint to go to management. It comes as a result of the data that's already in there. However, every site is a little bit different in that you're likely going to be interested in different things. So in a particular demographic, you might be really interested in the people metrics. So keeping our people happy, not just pay and comp, but also mental health and how do they feel about the culture of the organization. And we've got some data actually on what that could be or what that is in some cases. We've got comparables here for lots of niche industries, whether it's retail, grocery, or produce wholesale, or consumer packaged goods, or many others, as well as small, mid-cap, and large sites, which are different organizations in many cases. You're able to automatically change some of the weightings. So if the financial performance of the organization is a little less critical than the operational or the people stats, we can change those. We can update that so that at the end of the day, you've got a model or a scorecard that's comparable to consistent benchmarks, but custom to what's important for your particular site. So now we get to choose KPIs. So in this case, like I mentioned, the tool's got about 125 pretty tactical KPIs available across all domains within the 4 walls, and then some inbound and outbound. And so we can choose what's important to us. It could be, I want to know how many cases per hour we're picking in the freezer for ice cream, because this is a particular hot button issue for us. And, we're only getting out 46 cases, but we're paying, 1.5 times pay for those conditions. So, and we're constantly late to the dock. So it could be that we pick and choose some of these. It could be that you don't actually have some of these metrics. We just turn those off. But you do have the ability to choose a fairly enormous set of measurements here for KPIs. One of the cool things about this too is especially, and this isn't applicable for everything, but for a number of these, whether it's turnover, cost per case, the ratio of shared service support, average EBITDA per employee, there are definitely some indicators here where if there is a gap between you and competitor, we can actually automate the business case if we know a few key things. How big is your site? What are our hourly pay? What's your EBITDA structure? What's your financial structure? What's your operating expenses? What's your revenues? And so we're able to take some of those and automatically generate a rough business case, low, mid, high, based on how we stand. So we can take a lot of that work out and vet that with the finance rep. And so as we ingest all these KPIs, we see how you're doing. We can say, looks like you've got, 5 million in EBITDA, and we can spread that across a couple of years in terms of project work to actually achieve that. So very cool having the ability to automate some of the business case elements of that. And finally, in terms of some of the summary outputs, we can actually summarize what those areas are, both anecdotally and with some of these metrics. So this is just an example of a slide where we can show the opportunity, but also the quality of data. So in some cases, you may not trust portions of your data, whether it's on velocity or cases picked. And so therefore, we'll take it with a grain of salt and maybe take the low end of the cost savings. So we're able to, again, create some portrayals. And like I mentioned earlier, you press a button and these things start to pop out automatically, these charts and graphs and portrayals to show where you're at versus comp. So I think this is definitely, again, one of those kinds of tools that, takes the speed of maybe doing a 3 or 4 month assessment or going through a longer term thing and doing it in a matter of 3 or 4 weeks. And so at the end of this, you press the button, you choose what's important to you, and a 40-page presentation spits out, here are the 21 opportunities that are worth $6 million in EBITDA on the low end. And this is how you're going to get there. This is who should do what. And we go and we implement. And so, again, having the ability to do this rapidly and focus more on the implementation rather than all the study and the analysis is quite critical. And that's why we've got a tool that seems to be working quite well with our client set. So I think that covers this section, at least of the tool, Bob and Craig's sort of state of the industry, and also why we would do some rapid benchmarking, why that's important to you in a time where timing is critical, and we've got scarce resources working on an enormous amount of improvement projects. So with that, Maggie, I'll turn it back over to you to see what questions have come in. And I think we've got a few that we'll address. And again, as you've got some, type it to us in the chat there, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. So I'll just hop in here to field some questions. I'll stop sharing my screen actually. And then if any other come in throughout, then just please add them into the chat box here. So the first question that came in was, what are some of the obstacles that you project the supply chain will face in 2022, and how can you mitigate some of those risks? I'll open it
Craig,
up.
do you want to start and then maybe turn it over to Bob?
Sure. The big thing, and Jared, you talked about it, is the people. We're consistently seeing this as a challenge in office, in the warehouse, everywhere you go. Mitigation, there's no simple answer when it comes to people. The only thing we found is successful is obviously be accommodating as much as possible and be realistic, and highlight your advantages as much as you can, because we're in a place now where we're getting played off on each other. So we got to step forward and say, here's why working for us is better than the guy down the street. Bob?
The biggest challenges that I see going forward, I'll summarize in 3 words: capacity, capacity, capacity. I honestly do not see it getting very much better. We're starting to see some of the ports have less backlogs, but the key is going to be to work with your carriers. Like I said previously, the guys that are doing the job for you, help them reduce their costs as much as you can. And you know what? The key is to make them want to carry your freight. That to me is the secret.
The only thing I'd add, Maggie, just on the people side, is some successes that we're seeing, especially within the 4 walls and on the hourly side, which is really, your core operators. Finding inventory analysts and shared services is also challenging. But I think what we're seeing is, in some cases, 50 to 75% turnover, especially on those tough shifts like second or third shift, picking cases and loading trucks. Those are the key folks that run your sites. We're starting to see, I think, obviously comp is a dynamic, no doubt about it, but we're starting to see organizations succeed where they've got a culture to write home about. They've got friends there. They love their supervisor. They've got potentially comp that's related to both team-based goals and individual goals, but those goals are not just how many cases we pick based on a labor standard that might be antiquated. We're seeing them based on a balanced scorecard of velocity, quality, culture, mental health, and a number of other dynamics that we measure so that it's balanced. And we're seeing creative opportunities around, getting people college degrees and certificates and things that, so the organizations that are succeeding and keeping those people are doing those things. The other big thing is succession planning. So do you have a view as to how you could be a supervisor and then be, assistant manager and be a GM potentially one day? What's that path look like? Oftentimes it's just completely invisible. We don't even talk about it. Just pick your cases. But those organizations where there's a path, there's a dialogue about that or some sort of framework, are also winning. So I think there are some things that we're seeing work. It's still challenging, to Craig's point, no doubt.
Mm-hmm. And with the capacity constraints and the increased turnover, how can organizations keep their warehousing and logistics practices flexible as demand fluctuates and even as their resources fluctuate?
Yeah, Craig, why don't you go in, and then Bob, and I'll finish off here.
Flexibility. I mean, listen, the ultimate way, and it's a longer term for flexibility, is certainly in the warehousing environment is automation. But in the shortest of terms, if you're dealing with an army of people, it's a challenge because you're different, dealing with schedules and people's patterns. But yeah, we're at a point, and certainly what I'm seeing now is you tend to overstaff. What you end up doing is you overstaff, and you certainly leverage, the temporary labor pool. Because when you do that, as we all know, you go to temp labor, you ask for 10 and you're lucky to get 2. So we're starting to see that more and more, is get that flexibility, is just having the bodies.
And flexibility in transportation, it's really difficult because the shoe's on the other foot, and the carriers have now better information, and are evaluating their options. But again, I go back and I sound like a broken record. It's work with the carrier, help them reduce their costs, and they'll like moving your freight.
The only final thing I'd add is, and David Poirier's got a great quote, which is to be disciplined but not rigid. So I think I don't know if we're seeing enough on the management side of proper scenario planning. So we can't be flexible to every single potential option or permutation on inbound or how we're going to react. But there's likely 3 scenarios where 80% of the variation falls within. And how disciplined can we be on the basics based on how each one of these scenarios plays out? So as you get visibility to some of the inbound nodes, and you can predict, using plus or minus, using some basic stats, we see organizations cop out a little too quickly of, oh, this is too much variation. It's going to be between 3 and 12 weeks. Well, the last 6 shipments have been 7.2 weeks with a standard deviation of 2.6 weeks. So are we having conversations as a leadership group based on, here are the 3 scenarios that encompass 80% of the variation. This is exactly what we're going to do if any one of these 3 goes, and we go. So reactionary and victim behavior is what's causing some of the gap between who's doing it better than who's doing it worse as well.
And Jared, this one came in for you, so largely based on your benchmarking tool, but it looks like you're able to collect a lot of data from this tool. So how do you really use that amount of data effectively and distill the most relevant information down to make those decisions?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, obviously there's a sea of KPIs. We didn't want a tool that showed you, routing efficiency and cases per hour picked and maybe revenue per square foot or EBITDA per square foot. There's a core 5 when you look at a site, but we wanted to go down to a really tactical level to get some of the insights on how do I actually drive these levers. So within each, we've got, about 8 to 10 buckets. So there's a people score, and within there's a mental health score. There's really a score around the maturity of your business processes. So we're able to take and distill those upwards. So let's say there's 15 of those KPIs that we're interested in are around the people side. We can give you a people score. You're a 7.2 out of 10. These are the gaps. This is what your competitors are doing, at least on visibility of processes, risks, safety, mental health, average hourly pay compared to comp, average benefit level, et cetera. So again, we don't have to get lost in the 120. We can group those up into the 6 to 8 bite-sized chunks that represent each of those buckets. So we do affinity group those upwards for simplicity. Good question.
And I'll just ask the 3 of you, do you have any final takeaways or quick wins that you can share with our group that they can start implementing in their strategies?
The one that I'll mention is get the data, because everything depends on data. And there's so many sources now for visibility data, predicting what the pricing is going to be in specific lanes. And you can do the comparisons not only on the lanes where you've got high costs compared to what the industry average is, but also can tell you where your rates are so much better than what everybody else is paying in that lane, so that you may do some contingency planning in terms of being able to make sure you don't get hammered all of a sudden and you're aware of what's going on.
I'll build on Bob's point, data, and I would take it a step further and say get actionable information. Because right now, organizations I spend time with, they swim in data, so much of it, and leveraging, working with individuals like Jared, transforming into actionable information is critical. Jared?
So work closely with your frontline supervisors, those that are managing 10, 12, 15 direct reports, those that are doing most of the work on this on site, or those are the folks that are really, I think we can do a good job about, here are the 12 things on your checklist you got to monitor. I don't know if we do as good of job of instructing or teaching or coaching them how to drive the culture within the organization. That's one thing that you don't need fancy tools. You don't need all these things to necessarily do. Just make it be a place that people want to come hang out and have fun and work in. Culture is something you can do independent of all this. That I wouldn't call it a quick win, because it takes years in some cases to build that, but that's something you can do independent of the technical and the data side. And I think we forget to include our frontline supervisors in that as culture carriers within the organization.
Great. Well, with that, I'd like to thank the three of you, or our panelists, for sharing your great insights and sharing your quick wins and thoughts on this pressing issue. And I'd like to thank all our attendees for joining us today. As mentioned before, we will be sending out a recording of this presentation for you to look back at your will, and it will also include some contact information for us. So please reach out if you have any other questions for either one of our panelists. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week. And thanks again.